Hey everyone, welcome back to week 2. I want to start with just some basic reminders. This is the first week you're going to be doing some in-depth assignments, and that means you're going to have to get in the habit of going to these assigned articles and pulling pieces of what you're reading out and then explaining what you've read and, importantly, putting it into conversation with your own life. These discussion posts are really designed to invite you to do that. And for full credit, as they all say on the post, and I want to remind you as we start the lecture this week, you've got to talk about some of the content that was in the reading, show me that you've actually engaged with it. You've got to cite your work because we're all in college here. And then you've got to talk about how that theory or idea or concept you're using, you've got your choice of any in the article, but the one you pick, how does it apply to your life? It's as simple as that. And we talked about this a little bit last week with the conversation about what is reflective writing. So let's jump in this week. Again, I've got some visuals to help us go through the content. A reminder, I always expect you to do the readings before these lectures. I'll talk a little bit about what's in the readings, but my goal is really to go outside of what's in the readings. I expect you to already have gotten a hold of a lot of the basics. So just because I mention a few things that we read about this week, don't assume you can totally skip the reading and do okay on the assignments. Try this again. All right. So again, with the quick reminders at the beginning of class, accommodations, if you have them, get them to me so I can adjust times for quizzes, things like that. And if there's things that I can just do to help this class run smoother, feel free to reach out. If they're not out of line, I'm good to work with students. Quizzes, take notes on these readings when you do the readings, because if you miss a question or all the questions on a quiz, as long as you took the quiz on time and tried to diligently pass it, if the questions were just worded weird to your mind, you can send me your reading notes and I'll replace the quiz as long as you took it with the grade from the notes. All right, on to the content. We ended last class sort of at the beginning of a conversation. What is culture? And really, what is U.S. culture? Since this class is in the United States, it makes sense to sort of use what we can look outside our own windows to get a hold of cultural concepts in general and try to figure out what it is that makes a culture a culture. Why are they different? And most importantly, the point of this class, how is that going to impact me when I travel abroad? So I want to stay with this theme and talk about U.S. culture, which I talked about at the end of the last lectures being hard to get a hold of. Even if you've lived in the United States, you probably realize, aside from shallow answers like explosions on movies, cheeseburgers and big screen TVs and NASCAR and baseball, apple pie, shallow things, we have a really hard time putting our thumb on what is our deep culture though. And we hit on a little bit of why. It's because if you really go back to some of our deepest, most intricately compelling histories of the United States, the things that really designed culture at the beginning, the foundation, oh God, there's a lot of stuff there that's distasteful. And the truth is there's still a lot of things. So I'd mentioned these catchphrases of patriotism, America's the greatest country ever, and they seldom finish the sentence. In what area? So we thought it might be worth starting today with a few examples. The United States is not the greatest country when it comes to how much we spend on daycare for toddlers. We're actually the 50th country on the list. $500 is what we spend. We're the only high income country classified as high income on the scale of the world that does not guarantee health care to citizens. So we cannot say that our healthcare system is the best in the world. Our life expectancy, we're not the best at that. In fact, we've had quite a massive drop off of recent years. We have one of the highest rates of infant mortality deaths, so we can't say that we're the best at that. Deaths from assault are the highest, so I mean, maybe you could construe this in a way that says we're the best at getting people killed in violent ways. But again, this is the sort of thing that when people look deeply at how we appear from the outside, when someone's looking in, this isn't very fun to think about and talk about. And honestly, it compels any citizen that hears it to think about how they might be playing into this system and whether or not they're responsible for changing it. One of our cultural identities in the US is just don't look at it. We're a country where people have more chronic co-occurring conditions than almost anywhere else on earth. And then, of course, when we really think about culture, what we usually think of is what lies between these two things, right? Deep underneath are the statistics, the things that reveal the underside that we're kind of like, ooh. At the shallow, shallow end is things like NASCAR and rock and roll. But somewhere in the middle of those two is something that is a little more textured. And we get a really good view of it in the US through another piece of our culture, media, something else that we actually are well known for around the world. So let's take a look at one example of this. This is from a film called Pulp Fiction.
So tell me again about the hash bar.
Okay, what you want to know?
Hash is legal now, right?
That's legal, but it ain't 100% legal. I mean, you just can't walk into a restaurant, roll the joint, and start puffing away. I mean, they want you to smoke in your home or certain designated places.
No, the hash bar.
Yeah, it breaks down like this. Okay, it's legal to buy it. It's legal to own it. And if you're the proprietor of a hash bar, it's legal to sell it. It's legal to carry it, but that doesn't matter because get a load of this. All right, if you get stopped by a cop in Amsterdam, it's illegal for them to search you. I mean, that's the right that cops in Amsterdam don't have.
Oh man, I'm going. That's all it is to it. I'm fucking going.
No, baby, you think it the most. You know what the funniest thing about Europe is?
What?
It's little differences. I mean, they got the same shit over there that they got here, but it's just there. It's a little different.
Example.
All right, well, you can walk into a movie theater in Amsterdam and buy a beer. And I don't mean just like, paper cup. I'm talking about a glass of beer. And in Paris, you can buy beer in McDonald's. And you know what they call a quarter pounder with cheese in Paris?
They don't call it a quarter pounder with cheese?
Oh, man, they got the metric system. They don't know what the fuck a quarter pounder is.
Well, what do they call it?
They call it Royale with cheese.
Royale with cheese.
That's right.
What do they call a Big Mac?
Big Mac's a Big Mac, but they call it Le Big Mac.
Big Mac. What do they call a Whopper?
I don't know. I didn't go on a Burger King. You know what they put on French fries in Holland instead of ketchup? What? Mayonnaise. I seen them do it, man. They fucking drown them in that shit.
So a few things worth noticing there. This is worth looking at both as a representation of our culture, but also a a piece of how the rest of the world sees us, right? So not only can we look at this and say, "Oh, there's some cultural identity in the United States," but also an example of how the rest of the world looks and sees. And as you'll notice, I already said it, media, but a certain kind of media. It's pushing the limit. It's vulgar. It's sort of spectacleized, and anybody that's ever seen Pulp Fiction knows that that's sort of the epitome of this movie. But that second part, what I was talking about before, the meat of the sandwich between, we've got these histories and these statistics that are kind of bad to look at, and then we've got way down deep, and then we've got shallow cheeseburgers and NASCAR, and in the middle is what you might think of as the nitty gritty. What does it feel like to walk the streets in that culture? And he hit some of those things. In the United States, when you're walking around or driving around, you're thinking about interactions with the police if they pop up in a certain way. And because of that, we approach those interactions in certain ways. They have a gun, they have the right to get you out of a car and search you, things like that. Those inform how we act around them and what we expect. Whereas if we were in another country and we saw a citizen get in a cop's face because he tried to search him and he didn't have a right, and it worked, the cop walked away, we would have a different construction of what it means to be us that would eventually take hold if we lived there long enough. We would start to act the same way. It would literally impact how we feel, but not until after, and this is important, it's what this class is about, not until after a period where we're sort of shocked. We see it and we don't know what to do with it. It feels out of place. It feels wrong and confusing. The next time it feels a little less shocking. And eventually you've experienced it so much, it comes to inform how you yourself think. So some great examples of culture, some great examples also of how the United States defines itself culturally as being multicultural. What a great example. A white guy riding around in a car with a black guy, talking about the police pulling people over, different cultural norms and how they play out in different countries, the experiencing of traveling abroad and using that to inform yourself of other cultures, and showing us all that, by the way, this is now, in and of itself, this scene a piece of US culture. So again, just an example. I want to try to do that somewhat throughout this class to get us thinking about not just the basic stuff we read, but rather a deeper understanding and something that's much more boots on the ground, that feels like it's more personal to a lot of us. All right, let's jump back into some content. So these are things you should have read this week. You should have a bell ringing by now, right? Excuse me, about Cosmopolitan. Is my So one of your articles, I believe it was a Pius, talks about the idea of cosmopolitan. And what is cosmopolitanism? What does it mean to be a cosmopolitan? This is a word that's had some funky uh, connections to it over the years. 100 years ago, it meant something very different than it does now. But as we read, it doesn't mean a magazine, doesn't mean the guy on Seinfeld, if you're as old as I am, and it doesn't mean the fruity drink you can order at the bar, Cosmopolitan. We're talking about something very different. We're talking about somebody that first and foremost thinks of themselves not as a citizen of a country or a member of a family or a member of a community organization or a member of a church. They think of themselves as all those things too, but only after they think of themselves, number one, is a member of the human race. And I know that might sound simple, but think about what that means in a global culture when you can literally go to DIA, get on an airplane, and fly to Istanbul or to Australia or to Greece or almost anywhere. You can go to another culture and transplant yourself, and you're going to get there and things will be different. Some of them are going to be not so shocking, just confusing, like you go to order a quarter pounder and they look at you funny, or you are used to ordering a beer in certain restaurants and they're like, you can't order beer here. Just small cultural differences that are going to make you feel a little on edge, because that's how humans work. It's going to require more mental energy to navigate that situation. A cosmopolitan tries to figure out ahead of time how to put themselves in the headspace to prepare for that and to just openly embrace the experience. And this is what Apai is really trying to get at in the article. Now, a few things he mentions that I'm not going to talk about the whole article, but Cosmopolitan's worth briefly covering. 2 minutes. Make sure you read it. Cultural relativism versus moral relativism. Sometimes an idea students have a hard time fleshing out the difference. He's saying we should embrace one of these perspectives and not another. And so to go back to our movie scene from Pulp Fiction, imagine if instead of talking about the different names of cheeseburgers or the different way drug laws are handled, they were talking about something that was atrocious to us. Say the way elders are ritualistically killed at a certain age, or maybe just kicked out onto the street and left to fend for themselves as they die in loneliness and isolation, exposed to the elements. Something that we would just hear from our Western ears and maybe from any ear and be horrified. How could they do that? So what he is saying is, with cultural relativism, the more you travel abroad, the more you realize you're going to see things that shock you, that make you initially feel like, what is going on? And the natural feeling that comes along with that is disgust, this is immoral, this is wrong. So to go back to our Amsterdam and the police, you're from Amsterdam, the police aren't allowed to search you there, they don't carry weapons. You land in the United States, you get in a car and you're driving somewhere and you're pulled over and 13 armed men are standing there with guns pulling you out of a car because they mistook you for a stolen vehicle a few miles away. In that moment, you're not just going to read that as they must have cultural differences. No, your brain's going to tell you this is unethical, this is immoral, this place is awful, they're monsters, they're evil. And again, the longer you lived here, like many of us in this class, you would just be used to a system like that. You wouldn't like being pulled over, but it would not surprise you that if there was a stolen car in a 1 mile radius and it looked like your car, that's exactly what they would do. So think about how this can give us a way to negotiate or navigate rather situations that might be uncomfortable when we're abroad. This is cultural relativism. It's saying something that would happen in my culture that would be one thing doesn't necessarily mean that here. If in my culture this happening would mean my rights are being violated and I'm going to get $1 million in a lawsuit, I don't necessarily need to be shocked if it's happening elsewhere. And Apai is telling us we need not conflate this with moral relativism, which is when you just go all in with this approach and say, anything's okay. Oh, they're kicking people into volcanoes and killing babies because they think it'll prevent the annual floods from coming. Oh, well, it must be okay, even though they don't do it in my culture. No, Apaya is saying, we need not put up with abuse or any sort of awful behavior like that, but we still would add the cultural relativism part. In my culture, kicking somebody into a volcano to prevent the flood rains from coming through would be murder. That doesn't mean it's murder in another culture. It also doesn't mean it's okay. So he's saying that we don't have to suspend our ethics and morals to embrace our travel abroad experience, but we do have to be prepared to encounter things that are going to shock us just because they're so different than what we're used to. And that shock is almost always going to feel like moral disgust, like we just can't believe what's happening. So, in short, I like to make things simple, boots on the ground, as I say. Cosmopolitanism means don't be a jerk. It means assume that you are totally missing something that'll help you understand if you can just get a hold of it. And if you can remember what's going on and talk to the right person about it or have the right experience down the road, it will make a lot more sense than it does now. It doesn't mean you need to excuse bad behavior. It means you want to try to understand what looks like bad behavior. It also means to do it, to be a cosmopolitan, there are going to be lots of time on your travel abroad trip where you're going to have to breathe and rethink an initial reaction, an emotional reaction that shows up. But it doesn't always mean that things are going to, a week down the road or a year down the road, that you're going to feel as different as you might think. No. In the end, the person that comes to the US and gets pulled over might practice cultural relativism and figure out that's just the way things are here. We have a war on drugs, we have a hyper armed populace and a police force. Get used to it, but they still might have come to the conclusion that it's completely immoral to treat humans like that. Make sense? Cultural relativism, moral relativism. This seems one of those things that I probably should cut the slide out, but it is worth mentioning on week 2 when we start to dive into this stuff. Fallibility. In this class number 1, there are going to be things that you assume you've known your whole life that you bump into and say, oh, maybe I've been wrong about that. Be fallible. Be okay with learning new things and changing your mind. And then also when you're abroad, believe it or not, you might learn some things and have learned them wrong. And a few months later, bump into a new experience that you say, oh, you've got to relearn it again. Give yourself permission to make mistakes and update your beliefs. All right. Dialogue, discussion, and debate. On pages 9 to 11, the author makes clear a central argument of this piece, that debate or discussion will seldom change anyone's mind. And you can think of debate as argument, right? We're going to get together with opposing ideas and hash it out, and I'm going to try to convince you. Discussion is largely the same thing, only there's usually a power dynamic where I'm coming at you to give you the information and trying to change your mind. But culture works like the human mind. We can see new things and decide for ourselves when it's time to change our mind about something if the information is presented right. And this is more in line with what we call dialogue in communication, which is the field I'm in. It means showing up to a conversation with somebody you disagree with, and instead of telling them why they're wrong and offering them the evidence to change their mind straight away, you pause that and you first try to figure out why it is that they believe what they believe. And you sincerely try to figure out what they believe. And there's a trick here, wink, wink. If you really do want to convince them to change their mind, by first having yourself take the time to figure out why it is they believe what they believe, you will have provided yourself the exact thing that you need to knock out from their beliefs that the evidence could apply to, that if they went, oh, maybe it's not true, the whole false belief would come tumbling down on itself. You don't want to attack some piece of evidence that they already debunked and they don't care about. You want to use any evidence you present strategically to point it right at whatever the thing is that you believe this person has wrong. And in the process, occasionally they'll convince you that you were actually wrong. So we need to get used to one another, not with any specific aim, but just because we want to live together. This is why you're traveling abroad. You want to experience the world and you don't want to go over there and make a stink. So again, dialogue is what we're looking for in this class. I want to turn topics just a little bit here to talk about Richard Dawkins, evolutionary biologist. Weird person to talk about on the second day of a communication international travel abroad class, except maybe he's not, because our goal today is to get a hold of what is culture. And Richard Dawkins is who's credited with coming up with a term that we are all very familiar with now, meme. Now, I want you to think in your mind as you're listening, what is a meme? And what just popped into your mind? Now, think of another one, because I'm guessing examples are what's popping into your mind. Probably images that are kind of funny or kind of catchy, and then somebody writes something over them that's short and sweet that makes them even more funny or more edgy or more catchy. There's something about them that when we look at them, they say something to us. They work to communicate better than all the other images we could choose from. And because of that, they get recirculated. And we've got things like this, which are what probably popped into a lot of your heads. Maybe one of the most popular ones for the last 3 or 4 years. You've got this image that, compared to any other image, if you were trying to communicate, say, disgust of a partner who's seeing somebody cheat right in front of them, masculine inability to commit, the sexualization of our culture, right? Lots of things that sort of say something about who we are. So instead of it getting used once and then people taking their own pictures, the picture gets used over and over. It survives in the environment a lot longer and it gets reproduced over and over compared to the snapshot you took last week that might look just like this, but it's just sitting on your Facebook page. No one's using it. So Richard Dawkins is an evolutionary biologist. He studies genes, which are very similar to memes. So he coins this term meme and he says memes are literally any pattern, any idea, any understanding, theory, framework, anything that didn't exist that humans make that goes out into the world, and instead of dying because it sucks, because nobody picks it up and redistributes it and changes it a little bit and keeps it circulating, no, we're not that interested. Pops up once, it dies. It is not fit for this environment, much like evolution works. When genes came along that couldn't survive in an environment, they would die off. And when genes showed up that would thrive because they fit well in whatever the environment was at the time, those genes would basically fill the entire space, replicating. And that's what he's getting at. These are replications. And by looking at the memes in any culture, you can get a really good idea, again, of some of those middle level, not too deep and statisticky, but also not too shallow and NASCAR McDonald's-y, some of the gears of what our culture really is, because they're the ideas that go out into the public. And instead of people looking and just looking away like, not that good, they stick. They work so well in our media environment that they get reproduced and they refill everything until something better comes along and then the meme gets replaced with another meme. So what does that have to do with culture? As I'm saying, and most of you are probably already thinking this, they are reflections of whatever the affect is, whatever the general feeling, the zeitgeist is of a cultural identity. And you can follow them back and sort of pick up a trail of how things used to be, why they changed. If you're traveling abroad, you can use this same process to sort of make sense of things that might otherwise be kind of confusing. And you're trying to figure out, how should I act in this situation? Memes sometimes give you an idea of what is funny, what's off limits, what sort of things are popular in the minds of the people that live there, considering they get recirculated over and over again. So again, just tips as we're moving forward. Arpaia says this. What is he talking about? I thought this is a really odd term the first couple times, or statement, when I read this article the first couple times. Oops, sorry. Globalization is a threat to and a promise for homogeny. Homogeny, homo, the same. In other words, it's a threat to a planet where every culture is the same. That'll never happen if we have globalization and people can just travel everywhere. It's also a promise for homogeny. It means it is almost a certainty that if things stay the way they were, we'll get really homogenous in these cultures. My God, what is he saying? You've all read the article, so hopefully you've put that together. He's saying there is a process by which, when 2-cent t-shirts can go overseas and be put in place of $10 expensive local cultural shirts, a lot more people can afford the cheaper materials and they make their way into a culture. When Tupac can go be played on a radio in Ghana and people hear it and they don't have anything like that there, some of those memes, those patterns, those music styles will seep in and be woven into the culture. And here is your promise for homogeny. You might literally be able to go anywhere on the planet. In fact, with the internet, you probably can now go anywhere on Earth and listen to a Tupac song. Maybe not North Korea. Most places, though. That's homogeny. That means some things have managed to seep out everywhere. And as Apayo made a pretty good case, there's some good things that come with that. Now, on the other hand, it's a threat to homogeny, and this is where the heart of the article you're reading is. He's explaining to us in a number of different ways. We'll touch on a few briefly, but again, make sure you read the article, that this is the way we preserve cultures. Yes, cultures evolve. You can't stop that. They change. The United States is not going to be the same in 15 years as it is today. There's no stopping that. That change is actually beautiful. He says that cultures that aren't changing anymore are dead. And why would we want that? That's what we have with like the Latin language. We've had to try to bring some languages back to life, and they don't evolve anymore. They just stay static where they're at. Culture is about evolution, about change, about weaving in of new with old, about showing this hybrid, high mixing capacity to take what you want from a culture and throw out the rest. And again, he does that very eloquently. He talks about how cultures are really good at taking what they want and throwing out the rest. Paya's main points, there's specifics that are kind of funny, but when we use big words like don't be anthropomorphic, when we're talking to people that aren't eggheads, we're not doing ourselves any favors. He makes some great examples of binding feet in China, a practice that persisted for generations after the rest of the world started to say, you guys are evil, I'd never do that. And our condemnation actually, in some ways, reiterated that practice because they realized, well, it's unique to us. But when they started to think differently about it, noticing that like it took away the ability of some of the women to live their best lives, they changed themselves. This is back to Richard Dawkins' point that I will never convince somebody that he's wrong if I say you're an idiot, because their brain already switched into screw you mode. They're just not going to hear you anymore. But if we can get people to hear new information or get ourselves to hear new information without saying screw this, then we can sometimes just change our own minds. Same with slavery in the United States. I know we fought a war over it, but the mentality behind it certainly didn't go anywhere after the war. White supremacy and racism stuck around to this day in a very similar format to slavery for 100 years after that. So it wasn't the war, it wasn't condemnation, it wasn't you awful Southerners that made white supremacy finally start to shrink in the early 1900s. There was a resurgence of the KKK, but overall we would assume now it's a little bit less manipulative than it was. It wasn't the condemnation of their neighbors, it was their own beliefs. All right, so we've talked about cosmopolitanism, just a way to think about how everything is both the same and different in other cultures. So these are the points that I want you to think about that Apaya made. Every one of these is made in the article, but they all apply really well to the discussion post that you'll have to do this week. Chocolate. Homogenization of culture, guaranteed and denied at the same time. How did chocolate get to this place? They're concerned that it's going to go away if new import crops come in. Oh my God, globalization's destroying us. It's homogenizing everything. And yet the cocoa that they grow now was actually a replacement crop for something they grew 100 years earlier that they seem to have totally forgotten about. But when that crop was about to be replaced by coca, all the locals at the time said, oh no, they're coming in with this cheap cocoa. What are we going to do? They're destroying our culture. Cultures evolve, they change, but we have very short memories. And he does this with religion, with farmers, with clothing, with media, the Mike Tyson and the Tupac comment, which is suddenly oddly relevant again now that Mike Tyson's back in the news. And examples from the USA, the war on drugs. I've already talked about it once today, but as I mentioned last week, my main area of focus is the war on drugs, intoxication, addiction, drug use, all that good stuff, incarceration. And I like to use it as an example that can help us get a hold of like what is US culture. So in the United States, generally speaking, we've already kind of stumbled into this, and we'll see it again when we talk about drugs in a minute. We say, oh crap, there's a problem. This is bad. We realize it's a really big problem to fix. We've got slavery in the South, or we've got white supremacy decades after the Civil War ended, or we've got misogyny. Oh my, what shall we do? Women can't even vote our own property, or we're terrible to outsiders. We literally for a while had laws that excluded certain groups of people from coming here. It's a huge problem. Choose your problem. We put it off as long as we can, and eventually we finally offer some short-term solution. We say, fine, we're going to get to work. Let's solve racism. We fight a war. We get back to work saying everything's good now. The war's over, except racism's still really bad. Some time goes by as we forget that it ever existed, and it pops back up, and we're almost back to square one. And in the end, this is a system that's, again, part of why we don't like talking about our cultural identity deeply often in the United States. It's a lot of who we are. We are very proud. If you're a US citizen, that's not a surprise. Part of our cultural identity is patriotism to the max. We're so proud. How can we be so proud? Those people that say that aren't lying. They're in a system that encourages them from birth to do exactly this. By the time we're out of fourth grade, we've learned racism ended in 1964 if we're white. If we're rich, we've learned poverty is a thing that's caused by laziness, and it's not that common nowadays. We fixed it. We give lots of money away. If we're religious, we have other issues that are right in our own midst that we can say, well, it was worse back in the past. It's not as bad as it was now. And all of these responses not only don't solve any problems, but more importantly, they let us pat ourselves on the back. We feel like we did something today. And that system is problematic. So you can think of lots of examples of where people have for dozens of years and even today would say, well, look at the sexual liberation movement, or technology is at the breaking edge. We've solved so many things. Look at my iPhone. It's incredible. They forget that in 20 years, we will always look back and be ashamed of where we were today. We'll say, man, how could we have thought we were done with racism in the early 20th century? All right, so as I promised, though, I want to swerve this into drugs and talk about chronic wokeness specifically. This was what I grew up with in the 1990s, really the 80s all the way through 2010. And you'll still see these commercials. This is your brain on drugs. We had lots of questions. They didn't answer them. What they gave us instead was lie after lie after lie. The research has now shown that the consumption of those lies of us people that lived through the DARE program in its first iteration, when the lies were so over the top that at one point we were told if we take MDMA, ecstasy, it will put holes in our brain. That was published in the Journal of Science and Nature. It was bad research that was later pulled, but it started a whole craze of PSAs that were paid for, surprise, by the alcohol companies, by the pharma companies, and by the tobacco companies, because of course they don't want any other drugs legalized. We were never told that. What we were told is all of these drugs are dangerous and illegal. So it's just one example. The lies that we learned from it generally. Drugs are addictive. 80% of people that use drugs like crack or heroin will never struggle with addiction in their life. Now, that is not an invitation to go willy-nilly use heroin, because think about what you would do if I said to you, you can fly to Vegas and only take you an hour, free flight. You want it? Sure. 4 out of 5 airplanes land in Vegas after they take off at DIA. You're not getting on that airplane. There is still a risk with addiction, and these chemicals can be addictive, but the fact that in study after study, the majority of people that try even the most addictive chemicals never struggle with addiction, that's not the public story. The story we've been told is if you try crack once, you'll be addicted for the rest of your life. We've seen it a ton. We've been told drugs cause brain disease, including literal holes. That's also not true. There's something called alcohol delirium that comes after some long time drinking and actually can cause some neuronal damage. In other drugs, if they cut off your breathing for a while, you can have some damage related to oxygen deprivation. Drugs do work to rewire some areas of our brain with extended use, but none of these things qualify as damage. Meth doesn't make your teeth fall out. The lifestyle of meth sometimes causes people to forget brushing their teeth for days or weeks on end, to eat nothing but sugary foods, to not take care of their general hygiene, and this results in tooth decay. PCP does not give you superhuman strength. Surprise, PCP is ketamine. The chemical was re-engineered to slightly change one molecule so that it wears off faster. And ketamine suddenly has become this big popular bougie drug for which rich white folks to go get infusions of at the doctor's office for trauma and anxiety. We don't even think of it the same as PCP. We were fed so many scary lies through the 80s, 90s, and 2000s that it's hard to even believe a lot of these things I'm saying. But if you research them, they're all true. Addiction is a disease. Right now, we're in the process of rethinking that classification. It is way less stigma than what we used to say. You're a sinner and you're evil and demonic. Well, disease feels a lot better, but that still means infectious. It still means that if we really thought that way, we'd never lock somebody up for it. And we would never dream of saying, it's a disease. Here's the treatment. Go sit in a room with other diseased people and confess your sins to a higher power. That's not how we treat diseases. So it is something, it's a disorder, but it is not a disease. Clean and sober, the opposite is dirty and using. Oh man, weird. Rhetoric is what this is called. When certain words are built and used in a way that they contain power in and of themselves, we don't notice. Drug use makes us immoral. Drug dealers are rich. The majority of drug dealers are just trying to pay the rent. So why were we told these lies? Because they're scary and because they keep our culture running the way it's been running, including what was mentioned in the Pulp Fiction video. The police have some rights here that they do not have in other countries. And that only works if they can pull you over, find a crumb on the floor, and use that as probable cause. Or pull you over and smell some weed in a lot of places and say, hey, I get to go through your whole car now. If you've got a bag, I might be able to confiscate your cash and use it to run the police department. That's what happens in the United States. It's easier for people that don't live here to see it. They often describe us this way. But to those that live here, that are in the soup of media, that see things like I'm about to show you all the time, it's often hard to believe what I'm saying. So let's watch one such commercial. There was a study done, again, this is related to our culture, but there's one study done in a 78, I want to say, a long time ago, famous study, where rats were put in cages. They were given little drippy water bottles where they drink from, but the bottles had cocaine and another bottle just had water, so they could get water. And then they were just left there to see what they would do. And what do you know? According to the study, the majority of the rats just kept drinking the cocaine water until they died. They literally drank them. They used cocaine until they overdosed and died. One study. Now, that study was used to create commercials like this that are on the list of commercials I've been talking about all day.
Only one drug is so addictive, 9 out of 10 laboratory rats will use it. And use it. And use it. Until dead. It's called cocaine, and it can do the same thing to you.
Scary, right? So almost everybody that was a researcher in the near future to this article read it and thought it sounded kind of fishy. Like literally all the rats you put in the cages would just drink themselves to death. But it was a man named Bruce Alexander who picked this research up and started to replicate it in interesting ways. And the thing he was really focused on was that the rats in this study, when the study began, they went to their old cage where they lived with other rats in a big communal group, and they pulled them out of that cage and they dropped them in an individual cage with nothing in it except cocaine, water, and water. That's it. Bruce was wondering, I wonder if rats that use drugs are driven to use them more if their lives suck. And what do you know? He replicated the experiment and found that's the exact truth. So Bruce took rats and put cocaine in there and water in there, but he also put food in there. He put bedding in there. He put hamster wheels and toys. He put other hamsters that were friendly and they could have sex with each other. He gave them things to do to fulfill their life, and the weirdest thing happened. The majority of them didn't struggle with addiction at all, and most of them didn't even bother with the cocaine very much, even though it still caused the same impact in their brain when they used it. These commercials had already been on for 10, 15 years at that point, and they stayed on for another 15 years after that. The drug warriors didn't care. The reason is twofold. Number one, I mentioned tobacco, alcohol, and pharma have lots of incentives to make sure that we only use a certain subset of drugs. If weed and all these other cheap to produce chemicals like cocaine, it's $1 a gram to produce, that's too cheap. If that gets out there, pharma's going to lose a bunch of money. So they donate loads of money. It's not just pharma, it's the police. Every department across the country has multiple officers, if not dozens, if not entire sub-departments that are devoted to the drug war. And it's the only crime you can solve where you get to take all the money and property from the person you arrest. In fact, you don't even have to arrest them if you suspect them of selling drugs, even a small amount. Anything they own that you think you can say reasonably is related to the sale of the drugs, it's your department. You can either use the cash to run the department, or you can sell their property in an auction this weekend and use that cash to run the department. And the only way they get it back, even if they're never convicted, even if they're never charged with a crime, is to hire an attorney and fight it out in court before the money's gone. These are things that the United States has built in, but we don't know about a lot of what I'm saying because instead we're terrified of the drugs. And we're so terrified because of messages like this that most of us just give the police and the war on drugs the benefit of the doubt. Even those of us that have struggled with addiction like me, but definitely those that haven't, that don't have this as a personal trouble in their own life, it's really hard for those people to get a hold of a perspective that even is able to question whether the war on drugs is a righteous endeavor. So that's another interesting piece of US culture that as we start to add some terms and theories for how we would identify certain, what we're going to call supporting pillars or cultural norms, cultural regulations, cultural theories, things that we're going to go back to over and over from Martin and Nakayama to describe how we'll see patterns in every culture. They might be different, but every culture deals with gender. Every culture deals with age. Every culture deals with the larger social group, whether individualistically or collectivistly. Those sorts of things. When we start to develop those terms, we'll figure out a lot of them can be visibly noted if you find representations of the war on drugs like this one. All right. So for next week, today I actually was worried it was going to go way longer than this, but my in-person class is an hour and 50 minutes, so count your blessings. Email me in the meantime, even if you're working on these weekly assignments and you're struggling, talk to me before you submit it. We can work it out. One more reminder to deeply connect it to the assigned readings from Rapaya with citations, and quotes are awesome if you can find a quote that fits. Don't force them in there, but anytime you can, any way you can show me, I read the author, I've engaged with him, and I understand what it means for me, you got my approval. Office hours anytime you need me by appointment, as long as we can set something up, so just email me. And if you have questions, concerns, thoughts, articles that are related to class content, share them. Other than that, I will see you all next week.